Welcome to Midnight Scary Tales, where the shadows hold secrets and the whispers of the past come alive. Tonight, we delve into the eerie mystery of the forgotten Graveyard of Silence. What lies beneath its haunted grounds, and why has it been abandoned for decades? Let's uncover its chilling truth. Hidden deep within the misty outskirts of Blackwood lies a cemetery that the locals dare not speak of, the Graveyard of Silence. Once a revered resting place for the town's ancestors, it became shrouded in a veil of fear and superstition after a series of unexplainable tragedies struck. The place was forgotten by the living, overtaken by decay, and left for the dead to guard its secrets. For 50 years, no one dared to venture past the iron gates, their intricate designs rusted and entwined with ivy. Rumors circulated of ghostly figures roaming the tombstones, of whispers carried on the cold wind, and of an unbearable, suffocating silence that consumed anyone who entered. But for David Whitmore, an ambitious journalist with a thirst for uncovering the unknown, the graveyard was an opportunity. Haunted locations were trending, and David saw it as a chance to make his mark. Armed with a flashlight, a recorder, and his old leather-bound journal, he decided to spend a night within the graveyard to uncover the truth. It was a cold November evening when David arrived. The air was thick with fog, and the surrounding forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as though the creatures within were too afraid to make a sound. The massive gates creaked open as he pushed against them, the noise echoing ominously into the distance. Inside, the graveyard was a labyrinth of crumbling tombstones and leaning mausoleums. Dead leaves carpeted the ground, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and decay. David felt an unsettling heaviness in his chest, but he shook it off, attributing it to nerves. He set up his equipment by an old, ornate tombstone engraved with the name Margaret Elwood, 1834 to 1902. According to the sparse information he had gathered, Margaret was the last person buried here before the tragedies began. Some claimed her spirit lingered, tied to the curse that had plagued the graveyard. As he started recording, the silence around him grew oppressive. No crickets chirped, no leaves rustled, just an endless void of sound. David began to speak into his recorder. This is David Whitmore, reporting from the infamous Graveyard of Silence. The atmosphere here is otherworldly. It feels like the air itself is holding its breath. A sudden movement caught his eye. He turned, his flashlight illuminating a shadow that darted behind a tombstone. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. There was no reply. David's heart raced as he approached the tombstone. His flashlight revealed nothing but a withered bouquet of flowers resting at its base. As the night wore on, strange occurrences began to unfold. His equipment started malfunctioning. Static filled his recorder, and his flashlight flickered sporadically. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and the silence was broken by faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. At midnight, David stumbled upon a mausoleum that stood apart from the rest. Its stone walls were covered in strange, archaic carvings, and its iron door was slightly ajar. Against his better judgment, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside was colder, and the faint smell of burning candles lingered. A stone staircase led down into the darkness. David hesitated but ultimately decided to descend, his flashlight barely piercing the gloom. At the bottom, he discovered a hidden chamber. The walls were lined with shelves holding dusty, leather-bound books, and in the center of the room stood an altar draped in a black cloth. On the altar was a single candle, its flame burning unnaturally bright, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. As he approached the altar, he noticed a book lying open, its pages filled with handwritten text in a language he didn't recognize. the words seemed to pulse, almost as if they were alive. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, converging into a single, chilling voice that echoed through the chamber. "You should not have come here." David spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the room, but he saw no one. The voice continued, growing more menacing. "Leave, before it's too late." But David's curiosity overpowered his fear. He began to read aloud from the book, stumbling over the strange words. As he did, the temperature in the room dropped further, and the candle's flame turned an unnatural shade of blue. The ground beneath him trembled, and a deep, guttural growl emanated from the shadows. David realized too late that he had made a grave mistake. Something emerged from the darkness. A towering, spectral figure, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth that seemed to devour the very light around it. David froze, paralyzed by fear as the entity moved closer. The last thing he remembered was its icy breath on his face and a deafening silence that swallowed him whole. This concludes Part 1 of The Forgotten Graveyard of Silence. What fate awaits David in the depths of the cursed graveyard? Stay tuned for Part 2 to uncover the chilling truth. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to never miss a tale from Midnight Scary Tales. The darkness deepens as the secrets of the forgotten graveyard begin to unravel. What lies beneath the graves? Who are the shadows that linger? And will our protagonist survive the horrors that await? Join us as we continue the chilling tale of the forgotten graveyard of silence, a place where silence itself is deadly. As Ethan's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across the tombstones, the air grew colder. His breaths came out in visible puffs, despite the summer season. The graveyard seemed to pulse with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the crunch of his footsteps on the frost-bitten grass. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The figure from earlier, the one he had spotted at the periphery of his vision, was no longer there. Instead, a low, guttural whisper began to weave through the silence. It wasn't coming from any one direction, but seemed to seep from the ground, the trees, and even the tombstones. "Ethan," the whisper said, elongating his name in a raspy, almost mocking tone. He froze, his fingers tightening around the flashlight. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. There was no response, only silence. Summoning his courage, Ethan moved deeper into the graveyard, guided by a strange compulsion. It felt as if something, or someone, was drawing him forward. He approached a large mausoleum at the heart of the graveyard. The structure was ancient, its stonework weathered and covered in creeping vines. The heavy iron gate was ajar, swinging slightly as if inviting him in. Inside the mausoleum, the temperature dropped even further. The air smelled of decay and damp earth. Ethan's flashlight illuminated the interior. Old, crumbling coffins, shattered remnants of urns, and something that looked like claw marks etched into the stone walls. On the far end of the mausoleum, Ethan spotted a staircase spiraling downward into the earth. Against his better judgment, he descended, each step creaking ominously beneath his weight. The further he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing in an incomprehensible language. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a vast underground chamber. The walls were lined with shelves, each holding ancient, dust-covered tomes. At the center of the room stood a stone altar, and on it lay an open book. Its pages glowed faintly, and the words seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. Ethan approached the book cautiously. The whispers grew deafening as he neared it. The words on the page were written in a language he didn't recognize, but his mind seemed to translate them effortlessly. The keeper of silence must be appeased. Speak not, lest the curse awaken. As he read the words, a sense of foreboding washed over him. The chamber trembled slightly, and a low growl resonated through the room. Ethan turned to leave, but the staircase had vanished, replaced by a solid stone wall. Panic set in. He frantically searched for another exit but found none. The growl grew louder, and he realized it wasn't coming from any one direction. It was everywhere. Then, he saw it. A shadowy figure began to materialize at the edge of the chamber. It was tall, impossibly tall, with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. Its form was amorphous, shifting like smoke, but its presence was suffocating. Ethan stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering out. The whispers grew into screams, and the figure moved toward him with unnatural speed. Just as it was about to reach him, the glowing book on the altar burst into flames, casting the chamber in a blinding light. The figure let out an ear-piercing shriek and retreated into the shadows. In the chaos, Ethan felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He turned to see a young girl, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She looked no older than 10. "Don't speak," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. She grabbed his hand and led him to a hidden passage at the back of the chamber. The walls of the passage were inscribed with symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint light. The whispers and growls faded as they moved further away from the chamber. When they finally emerged from the passage, Ethan found himself back in the graveyard. The girl released his hand and turned to face him. "You must leave this place and never return," she said, her voice trembling. "The Keeper does not forgive trespassers." "Who are you?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence despite her warning. Her eyes widened in fear, and she took a step back. "You shouldn't have spoken," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Before Ethan could respond, the ground beneath him began to tremble. The air grew thick, and the oppressive silence returned. The girl disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ethan alone in the graveyard. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing than before. He ran, weaving through the tombstones, but the graveyard seemed endless. No matter which direction he went, he found himself back at the center, standing before the mausoleum. The iron gate was now closed, and the whispers had turned into guttural growls. The shadowy figure from the chamber emerged once again, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. Ethan realized too late that he had become a part of the graveyard's curse. The forgotten graveyard of silence claims another soul. Its secrets remain buried, its curse unbroken. Ethan's fate is sealed, a chilling reminder to all. Some places are meant to be left undisturbed. Stay tuned for more terrifying tales, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Midnight Scary Tales. Until next time, if you dare,